Tonight we begin with conversations happening in private dining rooms across Moscow. Conversations between oligarchs who built fortunes under Putin's system, between intelligence chiefs who spent decades protecting his power, between regional governors who've implemented his policies. Without question, conversations that all reach the same conclusion. Putin has become a liability Russia can no longer afford. And for the first time in 25 years, these elites are asking the question that was previously unthinkable. What comes after Putin, and more importantly, what needs to happen to make after Putin arrive? Before he destroys everything they built. This isn't revolution from the streets. This is palace intrigue power transfer, orchestrated by the same people who put Putin in power and kept him there through 5 presidential terms. The Russian elite, the inner circle that has profited enormously from Putin's rule, has made a calculation. The war in Ukraine has become an existential threat. Not to Russia broadly, but to them specifically. Their wealth, their power, their ability to operate in the global economy, their children's futures, and they're concluding that preserving those interests requires removing the man who spent a quarter-century protecting them. Let me show you the evidence. In the past 4 months, 3 senior figures in Russia's security establishment have died, under circumstances that intelligence agencies describe as highly suspicious. One fell from a window, the traditional Russian method of removing inconvenient people. Another suffered a sudden heart attack, despite being in excellent health. A third was killed in what was officially labeled a tragic accident. All 3 had one thing in common. They were known within elite circles as cautious voices, arguing for de-escalation in Ukraine and accommodation with the West. But here's what makes their deaths significant. They didn't silence the conversations. They accelerated them. Because Russian elites understood the message Putin was sending. Question my strategy and you're expendable. And instead of creating fear that enforced loyalty, it created urgency among the survivors. If Putin is willing to eliminate even loyalists who advocate caution, if there's no safe way to influence his decision-making, then the only option left is removing him entirely. The mechanics of power transfer are already in motion. Regional governors, the officials who control vast territories and significant resources, have begun quietly building alternative power bases. They're establishing relationships with military commanders. In their regions, they're strengthening ties with local oligarchs. They're positioning themselves as potential stabilizing figures. In a post-Putin Russia, this isn't coordinated rebellion. It's distributed preparation. Dozens of powerful figures simultaneously, hedging against the possibility that Putin's grip weakens suddenly. And someone needs to fill the vacuum. The economic elite, the billionaires who benefited most from Putin's system, are making their own calculations. Western sanctions have frozen hundreds of billions in assets. Luxury properties in London, Paris, and New York are now inaccessible. Yachts have been seized. Bank accounts are frozen. The lifestyle these oligarchs spent decades building has been destroyed by a war, many of them privately opposed from the beginning, and they're realizing that as long as Putin remains in power, as long as the war continues, those sanctions will never be lifted. Some are taking concrete steps, quietly moving remaining assets beyond Russian borders, through elaborate shell company structures, establishing residency in countries that might offer protection if they need to flee quickly. Most significantly, they're beginning to communicate with Western intelligence agencies, not overtly, not in ways that could be proven, but through intermediaries and indirect channels. They're sending signals that say, we understand Putin must go. We're preparing for that transition. And when it happens, we want assurances that we can be part of Russia's future relationship with the West. Western intelligence agencies are listening carefully to these signals. They're mapping the networks. They're identifying which oligarchs might be genuinely committed to change, versus which are simply trying to preserve their wealth. They're building profiles of potential post-Putin leaders and assessing which ones might be pragmatic enough to negotiate a Ukraine settlement and a new relationship with the West. And they're very quietly indicating through back channels that oligarchs who facilitate regime change might find Western attitudes toward them considerably more flexible afterward. This creates perverse incentives. The more Putin's position weakens, the more valuable it becomes to be seen as someone who helped remove him. Oligarchs, who spent decades competing with each other for Putin's favor, are now competing to position themselves as post-Putin power brokers. Regional governors are jockeying to be the figure who can claim credit for stabilizing Russia after the transition. Security officials are calculating whether their futures are better served by protecting Putin or by being the ones who enable his removal. The military dimension is most critical. Russia's senior generals understand they're caught between impossible demands. Putin wants battlefield victories that the depleted army cannot deliver. He wants NATO provocations that the military establishment has concluded will trigger Article 5 catastrophe. He wants a war of attrition that requires replacing 70,000 deserters annually with conscripts who don't want to fight. And the generals are realizing that implementing Putin's strategy will destroy the military, while refusing his orders will result in their removal or worse. But here's the shift. Instead of accepting this impossible position, some generals are beginning to ask, what if the problem isn't us? What if the problem is Putin? And once that question is asked, once senior military officers start thinking about the institution's survival as separate from Putin's political survival, you've created the conditions for military involvement in regime change, not a coup in the traditional sense, but quiet support for transition, agreement not to defend Putin if political crisis emerges, maybe even coordination with elements of the security services to ensure any transition happens smoothly without civil conflict. The FSB, Russia's internal security service, is conducting its own calculations. The organization exists to protect the state and maintain internal stability, but increasingly FSB analysts are concluding that Putin himself has become a threat to stability, that his war is creating economic collapse, social unrest, and international isolation that will eventually trigger the very instability the FSB is supposed to prevent. Some SSB officers are beginning to think about their role, not as protecting Putin, but as managing the transition away from him in ways that preserve state continuity and prevent chaos. The model they're studying is actually Soviet. When the Politburo decided Gorbachev had become a liability in 1991, they didn't assassinate him. They simply created conditions where his authority dissolved. He remained technically in power, but power itself had moved to other figures. Within months, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and Gorbachev was irrelevant. The transition was managed by security services and political elites, who concluded the system's survival required removing its leader while maintaining institutional continuity. Russian elites are asking whether something similar could work now, not killing Putin, which would make him a martyr and create succession chaos, but systematically undermining his authority until he becomes a figurehead, transfer real decision-making to a council of security officials, and regional governors let Putin keep his title and his dachas, but remove his ability to make decisions that are destroying Russia, eventually arrange his retirement for health reasons, giving him immunity and comfort. In exchange for stepping aside gracefully, this plan requires coordination across multiple power centers. The military needs to agree not to defend Putin. If political transition occurs, the FSB needs to ensure no crackdown on regime change advocates. Oligarchs need to fund the transition and guarantee economic stability afterward. Regional governors need to maintain order in their territories during the changeover, and someone needs to be identified as the post-Putin leader, someone acceptable to all factions, someone who can claim democratic legitimacy while actually representing a leak. Consensus names are being discussed. Some advocate for a military figure, a general who can claim to be rescuing Russia from disastrous civilian leadership. Others prefer a technocratic governor, someone who's demonstrated competence managing a major region and has no controversial wartime decisions to defend. A few suggest bringing back figures from earlier Putin eras, who've been sidelined but maintain credibility. The debates are intense, because this choice will determine Russia's trajectory for decades. What's remarkable isn't that these conversations are happening. Palace intrigue exists in every authoritarian system. What's remarkable is how widespread they've become, and how openly elites are positioning themselves for post-Putin scenarios. A year ago, discussing Putin's removal, even in private, was dangerous. Now it's become the subject of active planning among people with actual power to make it happen. Western intelligence agencies monitoring these developments face difficult questions. Do they encourage elite-driven regime change, which might end the Ukraine war, but preserve Russia's authoritarian system under new management? Do they demand democratic transition, which Russian elites will never accept and which might lead to chaos? Do they simply wait and see, hoping internal Russian dynamics produce an outcome favorable to Western interests? For now, Western strategy appears to be strategic encouragement. Without overt support, make clear that post-Putin, Russia could rejoin the international community. Under certain conditions, indicate that pragmatic Russian leaders who settle the Ukraine conflict and respect international norms could see sanctions relief, but don't get directly involved in Russian
ways
internal
that could
politics
backfire
or be used by Putin to rally nationalist support. The timeline is uncertain. Russian elites moving against Putin isn't something that happens on a schedule. It requires the right trigger moment, a major battlefield defeat that's impossible to spin as victory, an economic crisis that threatens elite interests directly, a health scare that makes Putin appear weak and vulnerable, or simply the accumulation of small failures that reaches critical mass, where everyone simultaneously realizes Putin's authority is hollow. That moment might come tomorrow, or it might take years, but tonight, across Moscow, the conversations continue, oligarchs calculating their interests, generals protecting their institution, FSB officers gaming out transition scenarios, regional governors building alternative power bases, all of them asking the same question: how do we remove Putin while preserving the system? And slowly, carefully, they're beginning to coordinate their answers. The power transfer has begun. Not with tanks or protests, but with the quiet withdrawal of elite support that has toppled every authoritarian leader who's lost the confidence of the people who put them in power. Putin may not know it yet, but the same forces that made him Russia's president for 25 years have concluded his time is ending. And when Russia's elites make that decision, when they stop benefiting from your rule and start being harmed by it, history shows that no amount of security apparatus can keep you in power indefinitely. Tonight, Putin still sits in the Kremlin, still issues orders, still appears in control. But in private dining rooms across Moscow, the conversation has moved beyond whether Putin should go. It's moved to when, how, and most importantly, who comes next.